Hey guys, today I'm going to talk to you about one of the most interesting, uncomfortable, and perspective gaining conversations I had while I was in Xinjiang. I still haven't figured out how to process the whole thing, and I'm not sure I ever will, but I wanted to talk about some of the thoughts and ideas running through my head, regardless of how uncollected they may be. The conversation I'm talking about is a conversation I had with a graduate from one of the vocational training centers, one of the ones that were specifically designed for de-radicalization purposes. I didn't record the conversation, and I'll explain why by first kind of setting up the story of my day, which acts as a pretty good contrast. Before going to meet this guy, I was invited into a local business owner's home, which was situated behind his restaurant. He had kind of like a village restaurant out in the outskirts of Kashgar. And this guy was one of the most friendly and jolly people I had encountered on the entire trip. He also had this amazing spread of food and snacks laid out on the table, and it was kind of overwhelming. I actually asked Kate, I said, was this put out specifically for us? Kate was my Uyghur friend and translator, who some of you have seen in my previous videos. And she laughed and said, no, that almost all Uyghur families have some sort of a spread they keep out on the table, usually covered, not only for their guests, but for themselves as well. And she showed me pictures of hers that she has at home. And she said usually she'll have a breakfast snack from hers, and they'd refill the different items as they were used up. But she did say, though, even though this wasn't specifically put out for us, Uyghur hospitality is famous. She said that if a stranger ever comes over to somebody's house, they'll be treated to drinks and food and warmly welcomed. And then maybe on the third day, they might ask, by the way, what's your name? So I really did get that sense. It was really nice to be around this guy, and I did feel really welcome. I noticed that he wasn't eating anything, and it seemed to be because he was a practicing Muslim and was observing Ramadan. So I asked him a bit more about that, and even asked to see his Quran, which he was more than happy to go and fetch. But the only time throughout the entire encounter where he became a bit more serious was when he actually offered to us. He said that him and his wife would like to prepare something for us to eat. And I said I wouldn't want to do that to him. They'd get hungry if they had to make something for us, but they themselves couldn't eat with us. And to which he responded pretty seriously, no. You don't worry about that. This is something we can handle. Just a really nice guy. We didn't actually end up eating there, and I headed over to the next stop, which was to have the conversation with the training center graduate. Now, when I arrived, the contrast in mood was pretty substantial. I mean, he was really warm and welcoming, but he wasn't as energetic and vibrant. And I had so many things running through my head, so many questions. I was wondering, was he simply more introverted, or was he broken by the system? Or was it because he knew I wanted to talk about a dark period in his life that he just wanted to move on from? I didn't know if I was imposing or if I was really putting him in an uncomfortable situation. Whether I was reading into it too much or not, I decided that I just didn't want to turn on my camera. I wanted to have a direct personal conversation with him. And we just started out by, some small talk. We were talking about his business, the pandemic, and other unrelated items. But when we moved into the conversation about the training center, I was really paying attention to his emotions and trying to figure out what to make of the whole thing. Personally, I feel like he was ashamed of what he had become before he entered the center based on his emotions when talking about his experiences in the center versus how he was talking about what he did before entering. As an example, when I asked him if he had new friends that he made that he keeps contact with from the centers, and he smiled and he said, yes, both fellow students and teachers he made good friends with and still today are in contact with them. When I asked him what made him a candidate for the center, this is where he turned a little bit blush, and I got the sense that he did kind of feel ashamed about this part of the story. So what he told me was that he was influenced by people who wanted Uyghurs to live in a certain way, and he started making the same demands from his friends. Some of them are really kind of quite strange things, like not smiling and dancing at weddings and not crying or showing emotions at funerals, or other demands about the ways that Uyghurs or Muslims should live. And he was even getting into fights and arguments with people who, from his community, even started avoiding him. And it started affecting his business, to which he said, I was really stupid. I should have just seen how, I can't remember the word he used. It was either unproductive or just stupid it was that he became. onto non-Uyghurs, he either stopped selling items or jacking up prices to Han Chinese customers, and just overall became more aggressive. He's a father and he has 2 kids. And so I asked him if his daughter, because his son was older and already kind of moved out, but his daughter, I asked if she saw the change in him. And he said that initially his daughter didn't see it because she was at school in Urumqi. But when she came home, she did notice that he totally changed and even had far more demands about the things she could and couldn't do in the ways that she should live. Even with that said, though, his daughter said that she wasn't really on board and didn't understand why he had to go to the training center. However, after he did enter the training centers, when he was coming home on the weekends, his daughter began to see a transformation back to his old self and saw that he was learning Mandarin, which she was also pretty proud of, and generally just saw a positive change in his whole mood. But I want to stop here just for a quick moment, a little bit off topic, to emphasize the point here about going home on weekends, because even the extremely biased and factually incorrect BBC reporting on the training centers showed that students were going home on the weekends. So when you're being told that these are Nazi-like intern camps where victims go home on the weekends, you start to begin to appreciate how out of touch with reality the Western narrative really is on what these centers were. But this particular man's journey, I feel like, was a story of transformation and what I cautiously call a success story from my surface understanding and observations from our conversation. But it's still, regardless, it's something that left me feeling uneasy. It's a really difficult topic to process. You know, if someone were to ask me outright, would I support the same kind of de-radicalization programs in Canada for suspected radicals? No, I probably wouldn't. You know, but asking me if I support the vocational training centers is kind of a superficial question and framing. You know, if you think about it, one of the reasons that could land someone in the centers is withdrawing their family from society or refusing to send their kids to school. These are things that could lead to having children being taken away from their families in the West and put into foster care. So now, if you ask me, do I support Western governments taking children away from their families? It's an equally superficial question. I grew up with half a dozen different foster brothers and sisters, and I saw how messed up they were from being moved around from family to family. I think I could probably find cases where the threshold to take someone's kids away from families in the West were too low. And you could even look up what was referred to as the 60s scoop in Canada, where busloads of Indigenous children were taken away from their families up until the 80s. And to this day, Black and Indigenous children are overrepresented in the foster care system throughout Canada and the US. At the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, in a full, legitimate, indisputable need for intervention, one of my foster brothers, who was thrown across the room by his mother's boyfriend, smashing his head against the wall, leaving him permanently, physically, and mentally disabled for life, absolutely needed to be removed from his home. But once again, how am I supposed to answer the question, do I support children being removed from their homes by Western governments? It's really easy to criticize something, and it's actually really easy to find legitimate issues with the system as well. But it's an absolute cop-out to not actually think about the entire context and make a better suggestion yourself, or actually produce something to improve the situation. You know, I bet there are a lot of things that happened with these programs in China that I disagree with. But I also don't have a better suggestion for many of those things. I don't really believe the claim, just to put this out there, I personally, I don't really believe the claim that these programs were optional, that the people who were put through these programs had a choice. I think the closest possible truth is that it was optional, but whatever the issue was, if they didn't want to solve it by going to vocational training, more severe legal courses of action might have been pursued. A kind of optional, but not really type of thing. Again, this is just my own theory, though. I do think that the net probably was spread too wide. I don't believe the numbers that the West puts out of 1 million plus people in this system. Other than this guy, there was only one other person from his town who also went through the training. And I kept asking people about how many people they personally knew who went for training. You'd find people here and there, but nothing that would support the idea of a mass incarceration issue comparable to the US's prison population. But nonetheless, I do suspect that during the height of this campaign, there were probably people who were put into these training programs who didn't deserve to be there. I just think that that's probably something that happened. One of the things that brings me discomfort is the idea of people being put through training for having extremist material, whether it be on their phone or otherwise. This just seems like something really vague that could be misused. But in the context of what Xinjiang was facing, and it was severe, what are they supposed to do with this? I mean, if we look at what the UK does, they just send people directly to jail for this. On April 30th, 2021, not too long ago, a 22-year-old ex-police officer, Benjamin Hanman, was sentenced to 4 years in jail for belonging to a banned Nazi group. 2.5 years of his sentence was directly linked to a conviction for possessing extremist material. There's no re-education attempt here, and when he's done his sentence, he'll just be released back into the public, and presumably more angry, more enraged, and potentially more sure of himself than he was before. This example is probably not 100% relatable because what was going on in Xinjiang was a more widespread and specific effort to root out extremism, which really was spreading quickly. So they were going after a large number of people. But, both local minorities who were not targeted by these programs and who were all saying that it was a widespread problem that really was spreading quickly. I personally know a non-Muslim ethnic minority who was called into a dorm room of his peers thinking he was being invited to a party to find out that it was a beatdown by 15 other guys who caught him eating pork with Han Chinese. While I was in Kashgar during Ramadan, the restaurants that you usually have to line up for were all pretty empty and easy to get a seat in. So a lot of people were fasting, but there were some Uyghurs who were eating. And back a few years ago, being seen eating during Ramadan and being exposed as a non-Muslim Uyghur could have meant serious consequences had the wrong person seen them. We don't really hear about this oppression and fear that people were living under before the Chinese government decided to do something about it. And it doesn't seem like people really care. America certainly didn't. There's no real good geopolitical angle for them to exploit this on. On the contrary, it's probably the exact it's the exact kind of societal disruption that they're dreaming of for China. On an interesting side note, when I asked him if he thought it was a homegrown issue or it came from outside influences, he said it looked like a pretty confident answer that it was coming from outside. But he kind of uncomfortably laughed when I asked him from where. And Kate gave me a little bit of context. She told me that he didn't want to answer because he didn't know what country I was from and he didn't want to offend me. So I didn't dig too much deeper into this topic because I felt like it would risk feeling like it was turning into an interrogation of sorts or trying to figure out specifics about who it was who influenced him locally. But I'm getting kind of off topic here. The reason I said that this isn't relatable to the Benjamin Hanman example is not to create excuses that makes it okay for the government to go after people however they want, but to say that I believe there would have been a level of widespread oppression that came from the government while they were tackling this issue. I can imagine a kind of a witch hunt of sorts, something similar to McCarthyism in the US, where everyone was under scrutiny. I can imagine how probably the mechanisms could have been misused by people too, who had domestic village disputes and would report their neighbors or people who they had business deals with that went wrong, reporting them as suspected extremists under false pretenses just to get back at them. I can imagine that with this less severe option than just outright sending people to prison, that there probably was far less reservations about casting the net wide, causing some people who shouldn't have been put into these programs to unfairly end up in them. I don't have specific examples of this, but based on my knowledge of how the government works here, and true to my comment in the Guancha interview where I said the central government says cut the hair and the local government says, okay, cut the head, I think that the government does tend to steamroll through issues here and fix things as quickly and effectively as possible. This methodology doesn't only produce negative consequences, but positives also, and is part of the reason the government here accomplishes so much. Take, for example, the 17 billion yuan water project that I visited, but I didn't make a specific video on. You saw a little bit of it in one of my previous videos. This was supposed to be completed in 2 years and provide safe, clean water for villages covering a 300-mile stretch of land. But when low-level earthquakes had disturbed and polluted the groundwater supply that they were using at the time, people started losing their hair and experiencing health issues from using water that had been mixed up with heavy minerals underground. And this pushed the government to complete the project in 8 months rather than the expected 2 years. We don't hear about these stories in the West. And to be frank, they're far too dangerous. Imagine if the indigenous populations in northern Canada who have been begging for clean water for decades found out about how China, the country that everybody is being conditioned to hate, can deliver something that has been nothing more than a pipe dream for them for as long as they can remember. But back to the topic of this widespread, what I think would have been a witch hunt for people who were falling prey to extremism. Would this have been a society that I would want to live in? No, of course not. I'd perhaps mind less than living in an environment of extremism, the environment of extremism that was spreading in Xinjiang. But to be honest, I'd prefer not to live in either. I mean, it's not a nice situation to be in. You know, it does seem like they've solved the issue, at least for now, and I don't have a better plan for them that they could have used, so I think we should keep this in mind. But still, I mean, it's not a nice situation to be in. I could probably come up with some suggestions on how they could have done it better, especially after talking to so many people on the ground. But that's easy. That's extremely easy to do. You know, as they say, hindsight is 20/20. We're after the fact now. We can look back at what could have been done differently. You know, one of my personal suggestions would have been to collaborate more with people on the ground who were affected by the extremism. You know, my friend who was beat up, for example, for eating pork with Han Chinese would have been a perfect ally to work with rather than just steamrolling over everyone without any sort of grassroots consultation and involvement. I'm optimistic about the idea that the government is going back and looking at where they went wrong and what worked well. I've been invited back to Xinjiang to discuss some of my ideas, not because someone saw me say positive things about China and Xinjiang, but specifically because of my criticisms I laid out in my Guancha interview. It seems like, I get the feeling from this interaction that it seems like up until now, no one has really tried to engage China with honest intentions to help. And when you look at the wider view of what the people who are pretending to care about locals say, it seems like they have ulterior motives to poke around in China on. Journalists are, of course, not here to help. They're here for a headline. And so-called human rights activists, especially those funded by American government NGOs, don't seem to be looking for issues in China to help solve. They're looking for issues to exploit or to say, see, look, this is why we shouldn't be dealing with China. You know, I think though, China deserves a lot of blame for the rich China bashing content available out there. You know, by not connecting enough on the ground level and listening to where they got it wrong while steamrolling through. You know, America really picked up on this window of opportunity and did a great job of pretending to care about the people on the ground. And the Western media loves to give these people voices as long as they're going to be negative enough towards China. You know, take Tersine Ziawadan's story, for example. I'm pretty sure there's a good reason she's upset. And Western media took a great interest in her. She was one of the biggest promoted stories surrounding the concentration camp survivor testimonies. But it seems she knew full well that if she wanted revenge and she really wanted to be promoted, she needed to upgrade her story. Her first version of her story was only good enough to get a written story on BuzzFeed. But it didn't really gain much interest, especially because she said she wasn't physically abused at all. Slowly, she upgraded her story to include being beaten and tortured, and it was her third version of her story which got her front page headlines on the BBC, CNN, and Asylum in the US. None of these outlets cared to reconcile the fact that her story had changed so much, and none of them cared that her passport was renewed during the time she said she was under arrest. This conversation has now been elevated to a level where people think these training centers were brutal concentration camps, and there's no way to have an honest, reflective, and rational discussion about what's really going on and what really needs to be improved. But I think that's kind of the point. It needs to be blown out of proportion to the point where it looks like it deserves nothing more than unconditional condemnation. And even the idea of having a mere idea of having a nuanced discussion about this topic will land you with a genocide denier label. If the West could bring this conversation down to an honest level, it wouldn't bode well for America and their hope to use this as a tool to condemn and discredit China, especially if suddenly people started to compare it against to how America handles extremism, both at home by sending undercover FBI agents into mosques and arbitrarily putting people on no-fly lists, or worse, looking at how they handle extremism outside of their borders, not with re-education, but with actual verified torture camps, or with soldiers on the ground, drones in the air, with bombs and bullets through Muslim children's heads. Suddenly it's going to be a pretty embarrassing situation for America to talk about China's methods if we were forced to do it in an honest way. But back to China's fault. Maybe there would have been a way for them to actually listen to Tursinet's actual true issues or the problems with the way she was profiled, and not create an environment where the only place she could be heard was by predatory Western forces with ulterior motives pretending to care. I mean, maybe it wouldn't have made a difference. Maybe she's legitimately a separatist or has been corrupted by money or some sort of extremist ideology. But whether that's the case or not for Tursinet specifically, I'm sure it's the case for many other people who had real issues. They may have been trivial issues when compared against the level of false accusations being made against China, but nonetheless real issues that the government could have shown care for. Instead, you've got this bizarre situation where people who could have been strong allies of China feel a bit disconnected from the system. You know, one of the most bizarre cases is of an anti-China overseas Uyghur activist who one of my friends in Xinjiang personally knows, and knows that she was literally beaten up by her father in an airport in China for having a Han Chinese boyfriend. I mean, this person, she could have been such a strong voice against the spread of extremism and bigotry in her community. But instead, for whatever reason, she's an overseas anti-China Uyghur activist. She's either been corrupted by something, but equally possible, she was let down by China somehow when more care and attention could have been given to her domestically. I'm not going to mention her name here, but there are quite a few people who know her in the overseas Uyghur community, and if her friends are watching, they're going to know exactly who I'm talking about. But I want to back up here a little bit, and I want to expand a little bit more on my McCarthyism example to describe what it must have felt like to be living in Xinjiang during the crackdowns. Because this example actually isn't truly equivalent either. In order for it to be relatable, the communists and communist sympathizers in America who were being witch hunted would have had to have been promoting violence and terrorism against the capitalist community and actually delivering brutal attacks on the local population. Had that happened, would more people have supported the McCarthyism witch hunt? Possibly. If we look back at the example of Benjamin Hammond, the ex-cop sentenced to 4 years of prison in the UK, many of the comments were celebrating it, saying, good, they should lock him up because he's a Nazi. Well, doesn't it occur to anyone that the people who are living under the terrorism of extremism in Xinjiang would have also wanted something to be done about it? I mean, imagine the stories that the Imam told me of people who had their ears cut off for drinking. Don't you think the Uyghurs, who had 1,000 years of winemaking history that predates even Islam in their community, would have wanted society to address these issues somehow as well? You know, regardless of what mistakes China made while trying to address this issue, undoubtedly something needed to be done. Who in the West came forward with better suggestions on what they should have done? Who even cares? I mean, I'm just going to say this directly. You're a complete waste of space if you're just showing up to do nothing more than criticize from a position of luxury where you weren't tasked with addressing the real issues and you never had to live under the conditions that needed addressing. And you don't really seem to care about thinking about the full context. You know, the CGTN documentaries on terrorism in Xinjiang only shows a part of what was happening. If I were to show you the other images of the individual terror attacks and victims, this video would be instantly age restricted by YouTube. But I highly recommend that you do your own research here and get a better understanding of the full picture. I am really surprised at how few people in the West think they're fully informed on the Xinjiang situation, actually understand what was really going on at ground level. Even people who know about the terrorist attacks in France or London and empathize with the people on the ground have no idea how many more times worse it was in China than these isolated attacks that happen in the West. I'm not sure if it was because they weren't given the opportunity to learn about it, or they just don't care to empathize with the people in China facing these issues, even considering how much more worse the situation was in China. I also find it really hard to believe that if the same thing that happened with the ETIM delisting, if the same thing happened in reverse, that the West wouldn't have been up in arms about it. ETIM took responsibility for many of the terrorist attacks in China, and America decided to take them off of the terrorism list. Imagine what message it would have sent if China took an organization that claimed responsibility for terrorist attacks in America, France, or the UK off of a recognized terrorist list. You wouldn't hear the end of it, and you'd be asking yourself, why did they do this? What's the purpose? And you'd maybe even ask, is there a plan to further mobilize or encourage these groups? Just imagine what the people in China must be thinking about this move, especially the people who were personally affected by the terrorism carried out by ETIM members. Use this logic to ask yourself the question, why did the US do this? It's probably worth also thinking about how the world would have reacted if China made the issues that they were facing in Xinjiang about a war on Islam. If their politicians started, using in a widespread way, if they started using the same kind of Islamophobic language that American politicians so widely used after 9/11, like with what Mike Pompeo was saying and Steve Bannon and his Breitbart news outlet did. I mean, imagine if instead of continuing to build new mosques here, China had politicians like in the West who were protesting the building of new mosques. You saw that happening in Australia and the UK and elsewhere. But China never did this. In fact, they even actively censored over Islamic content, Islamophobic content, off of their platforms. I could keep going deeper and deeper into these different rabbit holes, but hopefully I've successfully illustrated that there's so many layers that people need to be thinking about when they're passing judgment on China here. There's undoubtedly going to be things that deserve condemnation and that things that China need to improve. But once again, the conversation isn't being approached in an honest way to begin with. China let so many journalists in during the early stages, despite this common narrative that China didn't let outsiders in to see what was going on. But these journalists left with really dishonest stories about what they saw. And it seems China just started kind of slowly giving up on even trying this transparency route. I actually interacted with one of these journalists named Olsi Jajashi, if I pronounced his last name right. He went into the training centers and he actually uncovered a lot of things that match my theory and concern that the net was spread too wide and people were sometimes in these centers for very questionable reasons. But when I was discussing with him what he saw, he kept telling me that he saw people in cages. And I continually asked him to show me the videos or images of this. And he kept deflecting. He was sending me a bunch of different links to his videos. And when I said to him, can you send me the minute mark where I can see people in cages? And he absolutely flipped out. He asked, why do I care so much about the specifics of people being in cages? And he became actually quite aggressive afterwards, making personal threats towards me and racist remarks about Chinese people. It became, it was full mask off moment, and it became really apparent that he wasn't approaching the topic with honesty. It was a really fascinating experience because he himself was a Muslim from Albania, and he was showing or expressing a lot of the behavior I'd imagine you would have seen from the exact same extremists that China was trying to fight against. He was extremely disrespectful to Uyghur women when he was speaking to them in the videos, and he got really annoyed when he learned that some Uyghurs weren't Muslim. And as a matter of fact, this is really interesting. There was an anti-China overseas Christian Uyghur who could have been an anti-China ally with him. But the most important thing to him was his faith. And so he went on this misogynistic barrage against this woman, telling her to find the Quran and cover herself up. I mean, it was remarkable to witness and see firsthand how some of these extremists behaved. But on to my main point about Olsi. The one thing that I was concerned about that he uncovered was that many of the Uyghurs who went into the training centers that he interacted with said they were no longer Muslim. And this worried me that the training centers were specifically trying to take away their religion. However, I found that the person that I interviewed, the graduate, still identified as Muslim. He still had a copy of the Quran, and he still went to the mosque regularly. Knowing the wider context of the existence of many non-Muslim Uyghurs, and then when paying really close attention to the people that Olsi interviewed, they were saying that they weren't originally Muslim. They became Muslim before entering the centers and returned to becoming non-Muslim again afterwards. This still certainly would raise some concerns and valid questions regarding the idea of trying to train religion out of people. However, based on the wider understanding of the situation, it seemed like many of the folks he interacted with were attracted to Islam under false pretenses, which was specifically designed to lead them towards extremism. And they went back to rejecting it afterwards because the whole premise of how Islam was presented to them was false to begin with. Now, maybe they may end up later finding the true peaceful meaning of Islam and will convert correctly, but I'm not really sure about that. I really didn't see any barriers or efforts being put in place to prevent people from following this path, but I can only speculate on that point. So at this point, I've been rambling on for a long time, and I want to move on to my concerns for the future. It does seem, by a lot of the indications I've seen, that the training centers have been closed. I visited a number of coordinates, and it's something I'm going to explain in a future video. But this both makes me, I guess you could say, happy, but also nervous at the same time. Should this have been something that kept going but was relaxed and refined a bit? I'm not sure again. I'd be very uncomfortable saying that I support these centers, but I do wonder what now happens when someone gets caught with extremist materials. Is there no longer an opportunity for rehabilitation? And will China just do what the UK does now directly and just put them in jail? I don't know. What happens if there's a real spike in extremism once again? What if some of these graduates are just playing along and saying they've seen their wrong ways when really they're just waiting for the next opportunity? I mean, what if it's worse? And what if, because of the way that some people were treated, they actually became more negative about the government than they were before? I think the program was legitimately very transformative for a lot of people who fell down a dark hole. But I find it hard to believe that there probably wasn't some resentment left over by the way that some of these programs were deployed. You know, and if we look at the fact that the U.S. has delisted ETIM as a terrorist organization, like I said, and you look at how they handled their last Cold War with Russia by funding and fighting their rival through the Mujahideen, it's almost certain that the U.S. will try to instigate violence in Xinjiang, or at bare minimum, use them to target key Belt and Road Initiative points around the world. Because, of course, there are still Uyghur militants fighting in ISIS, fighting with ISIS in Idlib. We have literal footage of this, including their child soldiers. It seems like a pretty obvious playbook that the U.S. is planning on dusting off yet again. I mean, after all, it's one that they've used time and time again around the world. If this happens, what do you expect China to do at this point, if I am correct? And instigated extremism starts to seep back into Xinjiang with the goal of destabilizing China through one of its most important Belt and Road gateways. The U.S. has specifically put out a plan to fund $300 million per year in propaganda against China, targeting the Belt and Road Initiative. If they're willing to spend this much on soft power and psychological warfare, imagine what's happening under the covers, once again, in terms of planning heart attacks. You know, take a little bit of time to learn about how America did this specifically, and especially throughout Latin America, which we now know about and understand with great clarity. You know, once you really get an understanding of what America does, how they do it, and their normal playbooks, you can start to ask some of these difficult questions to yourself on your own. And then when you finally admit that there is a real issue and a real chance of problems that China is going to need to deal with here, why don't you come up with some of your own suggestions on what China should do rather than just criticizing them? I can tell you one of the best things you can do, especially if you're an American, is you can get America to start minding its own business and fixing their own problems and stop destabilizing any corner of the earth that suits some sort of an American geopolitical interest. Because the results of American intervention shouldn't leave anyone with much confidence that they'll do anything less than leave a place far more messed up than it was than when they arrived, pretending to care anyways. You know, especially if we use recent history as an example. I want to be clear about something. I'm not trying to shift blame to America here. You know, oftentimes there are real, true, and sometimes self-created issues around the world that are founded in issues and challenges that initially have nothing to do with America. But boy, does America have a great nose for this stuff. And they know, and they have a great talent to further instigate and push it in a direction that will serve their interests. with the ETIM delisting, the propaganda push against China, and the historical context on how America works, it seems pretty obvious that this is a valid concern to have. But again, when and if China is faced with this issue again because of instigation from the US, there'll just be a universal condemnation against China no matter how they choose to fight back and address the issues, without anybody looking at the greater context of some of the real, true underlying forces that are pushing this forward. I think in regards to China, though, of course, they need to do a better job as well. They need to take this period of calm and really evaluate what they did, how they did it, make amends with the people on the ground, and equip themselves to handle future issues with far more care than they did the first time around. I've got a few more Xinjiang videos on the way, and some of them are a little bit more positive and upbeat. And what I think will be the final one is we'll explore a little bit more of the real issues and some of the negatives of China. I know this is something that China supporters sometimes avoid talking about, and it's not because they feel China is perfect, but because there's an overwhelming imbalance to the narrative. And it's precisely the positives that are left out of the global narrative that they like to patch in. The West does a really great job of trying to stop those narratives from coming out. It's exactly why the PBS documentary on poverty alleviation in China was pulled in the US, because it showed something far too positive that the US, they themselves, don't do for their own impoverished citizens, and something that heavily undermines the dark picture of China that they'd like everyone to have in their mind. I suspect some people overlook the negatives, not only because of this, but because they're afraid that if they say, yeah, there's some pretty messed up things that happen in China that need to be fixed, it's harder to win allies to fight, to bring the conversation down to a place of balanced honesty. Who would want to speak up for China when they know that there are real human rights abuses that need to be addressed? Well, I mean, I want to address some of these issues with my content, and I'm going to face some of it head on. Not only because I'm encouraged by the results I'm seeing by delivering measured, balanced, and honest criticisms internally, and not only because I've seen firsthand over the past 12 years of living in China a commitment to improve, but because China's rise represents a net positive not only for its own people, but for the world. One of the most scary things for the West is losing their monopolistic and brutal control over the global South and its resource-rich countries. China is coming to the table with better options. And it shows in the results, and it shows in the fact that these countries are increasingly choosing China. So whatever you want to say about your spoon-fed China debt trap diplomacy narrative, you've got to ask yourself, how much worse are your options that China is making headway here with their programs and their Belt and Road Initiative? I don't hope that China takes over the world. I hope that they create an environment where people start to compete using better options rather than brutal exploitation or overthrowing of governments who don't play ball on Western corporate terms or finding excuses to bomb the hell out of countries. The West could have said, all right, guys, we had a good run here, but we no longer have a monopoly. Now it's time for us to compete on honest terms. But that's not what we're seeing. The West wants to smash China back down for selfish purposes. I mean, I love there was a recent reply to a BBC piece that was asking some really out of touch with reality questions about why these poor Africans are standing with China on human rights, using a tone that almost suggests these silly people are, without any agency of their own, making a terrible mistake, turning their backs on the morally superior West. I mean, give me a break. It was Britain committing literal genocide in Nigeria not so long ago. It was European rulers that would cut off the hands of 5-year-old girls if their father didn't harvest enough rubber. It's France still collecting colonial taxes from their ex-colonies. Give me a break. But let me get to this reply. There's this reply from, which was made by a guy named Solomon Asefa from Ethiopia. His reply to the BBC tweet, which ended up gathering even more likes than the original post, was, China is not condescending. China does not tell us how to run our affairs. China actively invests for a win-win engagement. China has made the life of the average African visibly better over the past 15 years. There isn't much China aid labeled corn and oil. He then goes on to say, the West opens the democracy and human rights page when it suits them. They are more than happy to witness a dictator ransack a nation if it furthers their national interests. Africans are not stupid, but will eventually catch on. China is not a saint, but it's better. In March, UK Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab urged developing countries to wait for the gold standard vaccines rather than those from China and Russia. A good example of condescension right in the news piece. Faced with death, they want Africa to wait, then take up alternatives. I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, but I thought this would be valuable context for those confused by the fact that I admit there are serious issues in China that need to be fixed, yet I seemingly still stand supporting China. Hopefully some of this provides you with a little bit of a wider context in regards to that. You know, China's rise to me represents the chance to improve, a chance that is so much more appreciated in the global south than it is in the privileged global north. You know, countries who have long exploited the same folks who finally have a glimmer of hope. It's these global north citizens, undeserving of their out of touch with reality sense of moral superiority, that provides them with the confidence and comfort required for them to advocate smashing the first real competitor back down who could bring about change in the brutal realities of how global capitalism has been done over the last few hundred years. And you know, I mean, the funny thing is if the average person in the West, especially in America, the bottom 50%, 60%, even 70%, actually meaningfully benefited from how global capitalism currently works, I'd better understand if you were doing this for selfish reasons. But you've been indoctrinated to support a system that doesn't benefit you or the average person in your society. It benefits a small, elite upper class of society that have calling cards for the military that you fund in order to protect their global corporate interests, while the fruits of those expeditions don't do anything for you at all, which is even more evident by the growing wealth gap and deteriorating situation for the lower parts of your society. I'm gonna leave it here. You know, I've got another video planned where I'll talk more about these topics and about where I think China went wrong and where they pushed it too far. But this is it's an incredibly complex topic that has never really been given the justice it deserves, in part because nobody really wants to give it justice. All that matters is they've found an opportunity to villainize China while pretending to be the morally superior party who deserves to advocate the preservation of the current global world order, who deserves to push China back down so that they can continue brutalizing and exploiting the world while pretending to be the good guys. But once again, that's a topic for another video. I'm going to leave it here, and I'll see you next time, guys. Peace.